4 years, Hunter watched from behind the cold, sterile metal bars of his shelter cage. The constant sound of barking echoed around him, blending with the heavy smell of disinfectant that lingered in the air. He spent his days observing the people who came and went, their faces lighting up as they made their way through the rows of kennels, choosing puppies with boundless energy or small breeds with fluffy coats. The shelter workers greeted each new family with excitement, and the dogs' tails wagged eagerly as they walked out the door, heading off to their new homes. But not Hunter. His cage, tucked away in the corner, was always overlooked. He had grown used to the sight of other dogs finding their families while he remained behind. Every time someone passed by, he would jump to his feet, wag his tail desperately, and press his nose against the cold metal bars, hoping, just hoping, that today would be the day. But the days turned into weeks, and those weeks blurred into months, each passing day a reminder that no one saw him, no one wanted him. Hunter's once bright eyes had dulled, and his enthusiasm waned. He tried everything to get noticed, barking like the playful puppies or sitting quietly with eyes full of longing. But nothing worked. His hope began to fade, and eventually, he stopped trying altogether. The sound of his own tail no longer echoed in the halls of the shelter, and he would lay in the back of his kennel, barely lifting his head when someone walked by. What was the point? There was no longer any reason to expect anything different. The shelter had become his world, cold concrete floors beneath his paws, dry tasteless kibble in his bowl, and the occasional pat on the head from a volunteer, which felt more like a fleeting formality than genuine care. As the days blended together, Hunter often found himself drifting into memories of a lifelong past, a life with a warm bed, a loving owner, and a backyard where he could run freely. But those memories were fading fast, becoming as distant as the sun setting on another long, lonely day. But one afternoon, as he lay curled up in his usual spot, something shifted. A couple stood outside his cage, talking softly to each other, their eyes locking on him. And for the first time in what felt like forever, someone actually noticed him. It wasn't much, but for Hunter, it was everything. His heart skipped a beat as he watched them. Could it be? Was this the moment he had been waiting for? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like, and share this video to keep the good vibes rolling and inspire me to create more exciting content for you. Hunter had long ago accepted that the shelter was his world, but something was different today. He noticed the quiet murmurs of voices, a faint buzz of excitement in the air. He had heard that noise before, but it was always for the younger dogs, energetic puppies with wagging tails, or the cute, small breeds that people couldn't resist. They always got adopted first. He had grown numb to the sound, knowing he would just remain here, another forgotten face behind bars. But then, something shifted. It was subtle at first, just the faintest sound of footsteps stopping in front of his cage. A couple. He didn't raise his head, as he usually did when someone came near, but there was something in the air that felt different. The man and woman were standing just beyond the bars, looking directly at him. The woman's eyes were soft, her gaze warm but curious. The man's face was unreadable, but his body language told a different story. He didn't rush past, didn't glance at the others. They were looking at him. Hunter's heart beat a little faster, but he stayed still, unsure of what to make of it. He had been here for so long, had seen so many people come and go without a second glance, that the thought of someone truly seeing him felt almost impossible. And yet, there they were, their eyes fixed on him, their voices barely above a whisper as they spoke with the shelter worker. He couldn't tell what they were saying, but the soft tone of their conversation made something stir deep inside him. He had always been the dog that no one wanted, the one left behind when others were chosen. He had learned not to get excited, not to get his hopes up, because every time he did, it only led to disappointment. But this time, as the shelter worker nodded and moved toward his cage, Hunter couldn't help but wonder, could this finally be it? Could he be the one to leave this cold, forgotten place? The click of the latch on his cage broke through his thoughts. The familiar sound of freedom, the sound he had heard so many times before, when others were chosen, echoed in his ears. His heart raced, and before he could even process it, a leash slipped over his head. The woman's voice, gentle and calming, spoke his name. Hunter blinked, still unsure of what was happening. For a moment, it all felt surreal. He stepped cautiously out of his kennel, the harsh fluorescent lights of the shelter suddenly feeling brighter than they had ever felt before. His paws met the floor, and for the first time in ages, he felt the space outside his cage, the wide, open space that he had only dreamed about. The couple led him gently toward the front of the shelter. He was hesitant, unsure of where they were taking him. The other dogs watched silently from their cages, their eyes following him with curiosity and envy. Some barked, others whined, but most just stared, as if they knew what was happening. They had seen this before. One by one, the dogs were chosen, and Hunter had watched them leave, knowing he would be left behind. As they reached the glass doors at the entrance of the shelter, Hunter hesitated again. Beyond the doors, the world outside was bright, full of movement and life. Cars passed by, birds flew through the sky, and the warm breeze that swept in from outside carried the scent of fresh air. It was the first real air he had felt in so long. He hesitated. This was the moment he had dreamed of for so long. But could it really be happening? The woman smiled softly at him, her eyes warm and filled with something he couldn't quite place. She knelt down slightly, her hand reaching out for him to sniff. He sniffed cautiously, unsure, but there was something about her, something familiar, something safe. She smelled like lavender and something warm, like the sun on a cool day. A safe smell. His body relaxed just a little. "You're coming home with us," she whispered. Home. That word hit Hunter like a wave. He had heard it so many times in his past life, but it felt like a distant memory. Could this really be his new home? Could this be the place where he would be loved, where he would never be forgotten again? The shelter worker handed the leash to the man, who gave it a gentle tug. "Come on, Hunter," he said softly. Hunter blinked, unsure of what to do, but the woman's voice was gentle, coaxing him forward. It wasn't just another walk, another moment in the shelter, where he was led back to the familiar coldness of his cage. This was different. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different this time. As Hunter was gently led outside, the world beyond the shelter doors felt impossibly vast and unfamiliar. The sounds of barking dogs grew faint as he stepped into the quiet hallway. His paws, which had only ever touched cold concrete floors, now brushed against smooth tiles. Each step felt like it was happening in slow motion, his mind racing with confusion and wonder. The outside world beckoned just beyond the glass doors, but Hunter hesitated, his instincts unsure. For so long, he had been confined within the shelter's cold, restrictive walls. The outside, with its unknowns and freedoms, felt almost overwhelming. His body tensed, his muscles frozen in place as he looked toward the bright sunlight streaming through the doors. The warmth of the sun, a sensation he had long forgotten, felt foreign on his fur. He took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh air, but it was heavy with uncertainty. He had been here before out of his cage, walking along the same narrow paths, only to be led back to the cold steel bars of his kennel. That had been his life for so long. And now, as he stood on the threshold, it felt almost too good to be true. The shelter worker gave him a reassuring tug on the leash, leading him forward. "It's okay, buddy," she said in a soft, calming voice. "We're going to a good place." But Hunter wasn't so sure. How could he trust that things would really be different this time? Could he let himself hope again? Or was this just another temporary escape? One that would eventually end with more heartbreak and disappointment. As he walked, he noticed the other dogs in their cages, their eyes following his every move. Some barked excitedly, others whined in desperation, but most just stared silently, watching him leave. It was as if they understood what it meant when a dog was chosen, when they were led toward the door and beyond. There was a silent hope in their gazes, but also a quiet sadness. They had seen it all before, seen so many dogs leave, only to return weeks or months later, rejected and broken. Would Hunter be different? Hunter's paws shuffled uneasily on the floor. His mind conflicted between the deep-seated fear of being abandoned once again and the flicker of hope that had slowly started to grow inside him. 4 years, he had lived behind those cold metal bars, a forgotten soul or a world full of faces that never lingered. Now, for the first time in what felt like forever, someone was taking the time to look at him. They were taking him somewhere he hadn't dared imagine. As they reached the glass doors, the sunlight hit his fur, and he squinted against its brightness. The man and woman were standing just outside, their expressions kind but expectant. The woman smiled softly, her eyes gentle and warm, as though trying to reassure him. Her voice was calm as she spoke to him again. "It's okay, Hunter, you're safe." He wasn't used to words like that, words spoken with kindness, with genuine care. He had heard commands and instructions in the shelter, voices hurried and stressed as people moved from one task to the next. But here, with the couple, the words felt different. They felt like promises, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Hunter allowed himself to believe in them. The man reached forward, gently taking the leash from the worker's hands. Hunter stood still for a moment, unsure of what to do. But there was something in the man's eyes, something patient, something kind that made him feel, for the first time, that maybe it was okay to trust again. The woman knelt down slightly, her hand reaching out for him. She smelled like lavender, a scent so different from the harsh, sterile odors of the shelter. Hunter paused, sniffing the air cautiously. The scent was calming, familiar in a way that soothed his anxious heart. She smiled softly, her voice low and comforting as she whispered, "You're coming home with us." Home. The word echoed in his mind, stirring something deep within him. He had almost forgotten what that word meant. He had almost forgotten the warmth of a home, the comfort of a place where he was wanted. The concept felt like a distant memory, something he used to dream about, but never thought would come true. But here, standing before these strangers, there was a spark of something he hadn't felt in so long. Hope. Could it really be his turn to have a home? Could they truly be taking him somewhere safe? He didn't know, but the thought was enough to make him take a cautious step forward, his paws moving closer to the door. With the leash gently guiding him, Hunter stepped into the sunlight, the warmth of it reaching his fur for the first time in what felt like years. He squinted slightly, his eyes adjusting to the brightness, but there was something about the outside world, the vast sky, the trees swaying gently in the breeze that felt like a promise. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder, could this be real? As the door closed behind him, the world seemed to open up. Hunter hesitated for a moment, standing at the threshold of a new life. The shelter was behind him now, and what lay ahead was unknown, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about the past. He wasn't waiting for rejection. He was just moving forward. And maybe, just maybe, this time, it would be different. As Hunter stepped outside, the air was warmer than he remembered, but it was also different, fresher, cleaner. He inhaled deeply, his nose twitching as he tried to process the new scents that filled the air. The noise of the shelter, the constant barking, the sterile smells of disinfectant, all of it was behind him now. There was a strange stillness to the outside world that was both calming and overwhelming. He hesitated just beyond the threshold, unsure of what to do next. The man gently tugged on the leash, coaxing him to follow, and for a moment, Hunter froze. His body was tense, like a spring wound too tight, memories of abandonment flashing through his mind. How many times had he been led outside only to return to the cold, unfeeling walls of his cage? This could just be another walk, another moment of fleeting hope, But then the woman's voice broke through his thoughts. "It's okay, Hunter. We're not going to leave you. You're safe now." Safe. He wasn't sure what that word meant anymore. It felt foreign to him, like something he had long ago lost faith in. But there was something in her voice, a calmness, a reassurance that made him wonder. Maybe it was different this time. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. The man led him gently toward the car parked just outside the shelter. Hunter's eyes fell on the sleek, unfamiliar shape of the vehicle, and he instinctively took a step back, his muscles tightening in hesitation. The last time he had been in a car, it had ended in pain, fear, and confusion. The memories of the old home, the sudden separation, and the coldness of the shelter flooded his mind. But this time, the couple wasn't rushing him. They weren't forcing him, they were patient. The woman bent down, her hand reaching out to touch him softly. "Come on, Hunter. It's okay. Let's go for a ride." There was no harsh command, no urgency, just a gentle invitation. Hunter felt the weight of her words, and for the first time, he allowed himself to trust. He stepped closer to the car, his body still unsure, but the kindness in their eyes made it easier to take that first step forward. The man opened the back door and motioned for him to get in. Hunter hesitated, his paws cold against the ground, but after a moment of contemplation, he slowly climbed into the back seat. The door closed behind him, and for the first time, Hunter was truly alone with his new family. The engine hummed to life, and the car began to move, pulling away from the shelter and into the unknown. Hunter lay down in the back seat, his body tense, but his mind no longer full of dread. He didn't know where they were taking him, but the uncertainty no longer felt like something to fear. It felt like a possibility, an opening to something new. As the car drove, Hunter stared out the window, watching the world go by. The buildings, the streets, the people, all of it was new to him, but it wasn't overwhelming. The gentle rhythm of the car, the sound of the tires against the pavement, and the soft murmurs of the couple in the front seat were all strangely soothing. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to relax just a little. He closed his eyes and let the motion of the car lull him into a peaceful state. The world outside changed as they drove. The tall, impersonal buildings gave way to quieter streets, lined with trees and houses. The air felt different, fresher. Hunter lifted his head slightly, his curiosity piqued. What was this place? Where were they taking him? His paws itched with anticipation, but he held himself in check, not wanting to get too excited, not wanting to risk being let down. Finally, the car slowed and turned onto a small road lined with houses. They pulled into a driveway, and the engine cut off. Hunter's heart skipped a beat as the woman turned around, her eyes warm and inviting. "We're here," she said softly, her voice filled with something that made his tail twitch just slightly. The door opened, and for the first time, Hunter stepped out onto soft grass. The ground beneath him was cool and comforting, not the harsh, cold concrete he had known for so long. His paws sank slightly into the grass, and he froze, feeling the unfamiliar texture beneath him. He hesitated, unsure of what to do. This was so different. This was real earth beneath his paws, not the sterile floors of the shelter. He had been so accustomed to the cold hardness of his former life that the softness of the grass was almost too much to process. The couple stood beside him, watching with patience, waiting for him to adjust. The woman gently clipped the leash to his collar and whispered, "It's okay, Hunter. Take your time. You're home now." Home. The word echoed in his mind once more, filling him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He took a tentative step forward, then another, until he found himself standing at the front door of the house. It was simple, nothing too grand, but it felt safe, warm, and inviting. The porch had a wooden bench, flowers lined the walkway, and the air smelled like fresh cut grass. Hunter stood still for a moment, taking it all in. The world around him was vast, but it didn't feel like it was closing in. For the first time, it felt like it was opening up to him, welcoming him. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but the feeling of possibility was enough to make him take that next step forward. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like, and share this video to keep the good vibes rolling and inspire me to create more exciting content for you. As Hunter took that first step into his new home, a wave of unfamiliar scents and sights washed over him. The grass underfoot was soft and cool. Unlike the harsh concrete floors of the shelter, it felt real alive in a way that he hadn't experienced in so long. The air smelled of fresh flowers, cut grass, and the distant scent of something comforting, perhaps home cooking, or just the warmth of a living space. It was all new, but it was warm, welcoming. The couple moved at a calm, steady pace, allowing Hunter to take everything in. The woman crouched down beside him, her hand resting gently on his back. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice soothing. "Take your time, buddy. You're safe now." Hunter stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the house before him. The simple, unpretentious home had a charm to it, a cozy porch with a bench, flowers that lined the walkway, and a sense of peace that he had never known. For so long, he had lived in the cold, noisy shelter, surrounded by barking dogs and the sterile scent of disinfectant. Now, there was quiet, a soft, peaceful silence that enveloped the space. For a moment, it was as if Hunter didn't know what to do with himself. He felt a sense of hesitation, of wariness, as though something inside him was telling him to hold back. He had been abandoned before. He had been given a home before, only to lose it. Was this place really different? Would it last? But the woman's reassuring touch on his back gave him the courage to move forward. The man stepped ahead, opening the front door, and the couple beckoned him inside. Hunter hesitated again, his paws hesitant on the grass, but the thought of the cold, hard shelter behind him pushed him to move forward. He stepped through the front door and into the house. The floor was warm beneath his paws, and the soft wood creaked slightly underfoot. He glanced around, taking in the surroundings, the soft lighting, the comfortable furniture, the dog bed in the corner, and the inviting couch that seemed to call to him. He froze for a moment, unsure. There was a bed in the corner, but lying on it felt wrong. It was too comfortable, too personal. Could he trust it? Could he trust these people? The woman knelt by the dog bed, patting it gently. "Come here, Hunter," she coaxed. "This is your bed now. You can rest here." Hunter looked at her, then at the bed. He longed for comfort, but part of him was afraid. Afraid that this too might be taken away. He cautiously walked over, sniffing the dog bed, but he didn't settle into it. Instead, he turned and walked toward the couch, sniffing the fabric carefully. The fabric felt different, soft and inviting, but it was all too new. It felt safer to keep his distance. The woman smiled, noticing his hesitation. "You can go up on the couch if you want," she said gently, sitting down beside him on the floor. "You're allowed to be comfortable here." "It's your home." Hunter flicked an ear, confused. At the shelter, there had been strict rules. No jumping on the furniture. No roaming freely. Everything had been controlled, rigid. But here, they were different. They weren't rushing him, weren't telling him what to do. They were giving him the space to make his own decisions. He hesitated, sitting on the floor next to the couch, not quite ready to climb onto it. The idea of getting comfortable felt almost too risky, like maybe it was too soon. But as the woman gently stroked his back, the warmth of her hand sending a sense of calm through him, he began to relax, just a little. He closed his eyes, feeling the gentle pressure of her touch. It wasn't out of obligation. It wasn't part of a routine. It was just kindness. After a few moments, the man sat down across the room, quietly observing Hunter's progress. "He'll need time," he said softly, almost to himself. "We can't rush him." The woman nodded, her eyes following Hunter's every move. "He's been through a lot," she replied. "He's not used to being treated with kindness. But he'll get there." Hunter remained by the couch, his head resting on his paws, the gentle rhythm of the couple's voices filling the space. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this safe. The shelter had always been a place of cold routines, sharp commands, and uncertainty. Here, there was none of that. Here, there was patience. For the first time in what felt like years, Hunter let himself believe that maybe this place could be home. The days at the shelter had been long, full of loneliness and confusion. But now, there was something different, a warmth that settled deep within him. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was being cared for, loved, and given a chance to heal. The evening passed quietly, with Hunter moving slowly through the house, exploring its new corners, sniffing the air and letting the unfamiliar scents wash over him. He still moved cautiously, but with each passing minute, he felt his fear begin to melt away. For the first time in a long time, he was allowing himself to feel the simple comfort of belonging. It wouldn't happen all at once. It couldn't. Trust had to be built, piece by piece. But with every soft touch, every reassuring word, Hunter began to realize that this place, this house, was the start of something new. Maybe, just maybe, he had finally found his home. As the evening wore on, the house began to settle into a quiet rhythm. The soft glow of the lamps cast long shadows on the walls, and the only sounds were the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. Hunter was still adjusting to this new world, this world that felt both unfamiliar and yet strangely comforting. He moved carefully around the room, exploring each corner. His paws clicked softly against the hardwood floor, a sound that had become oddly soothing. There were no harsh noises here, no frantic barking or the cold, impersonal sounds of the shelter. The silence was different. It was peaceful, not oppressive. It felt safe. The dog bed in the corner still lingered in his mind, but lying in it seemed like too much to ask for so long. The idea of comfort had felt like a fleeting luxury, something he could never rely on. Instead, Hunter found a quiet corner near the couch, where he could observe the couple. He didn't want to make himself too vulnerable, not just yet. The woman, Emily, sat nearby, her presence warm and calming. She smiled as she watched Hunter, a soft smile that didn't demand anything from him. She understood. She didn't rush him, didn't push him to come closer. She just let him be. The man, Daniel, was across the room. Reading quietly in a chair, Hunter glanced at him from time to time, trying to understand what was happening. These people were kind, yes, but were they really his family now? Could he trust them? Could he allow himself to be loved again? For a while, the house seemed to hold its breath, the quiet stretching on like a slow, gentle wave. Hunter's tail, which had been tucked low for so long, remained still. He wasn't sure what to do with it. He wasn't used to feeling secure, to not worrying about the next loud noise, the next disappointment. At some point, Emily reached over and gently stroked his back, her fingers moving through his fur with a tenderness he had almost forgotten existed. He flinched at first, the old habits of distrust rising to the surface, but something in her touch, soft and gentle, made him relax. His muscles slowly loosened, and his breathing evened out. This touch wasn't forced. It wasn't a routine. It was just kindness. "Good boy," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The words wrapped around him a warm blanket, and for the first time in ages, Hunter didn't feel like he was just waiting for the next thing to go wrong. He felt cared for, seen not as a forgotten shelter dog, but as a companion, as part of a family. Hunter shifted slightly, inching closer to the couch, his eyes still wary, but softening with each step. He was learning the rhythm of this place, the rhythm of a home. The man, Daniel, glanced up from his book. Catching his gaze, he smiled quietly, not with triumph, but with understanding. "Take your time, buddy," he said softly. Hunter blinked, surprised by the patience in his voice. There was no urgency, no demand for him to move faster, to trust them immediately. It was all about him going at his own pace. That was something new, something that felt real. As the night deepened, the couple moved around the house with a soft energy. Emily put her book down and stood up, stretching her arms. "Do you want to go outside for a bit?" she asked Hunter, her voice kind but neutral. He hesitated, looking toward the door. The thought of going outside again, after everything he had been through, was both exciting and frightening. What if it led to something unexpected? What if this was all just a passing moment? But the thought of being back in the shelter of the cold, lifeless cage made him want to take that chance. Emily opened the back door, letting the cool evening air spill into the house. The scents of the outdoors were refreshing: fresh earth, the faint scent of nearby trees, and the comforting smell of nightfall. She knelt down in the doorway, looking at him with quiet encouragement. Hunter walked toward the door slowly, his paws padding softly on the hardwood floor. When he stepped outside, the cool night air wrapped around him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a small thrill. The ground beneath him was real dirt, real grass. He walked out into the yard, his paws sinking slightly into the soft grass. It was different from the cold concrete of the shelter yard. This felt like freedom. Emily stood by the door, watching him, and for the first time, Hunter didn't feel the need to rush back inside. He stood there in the open space, his eyes scanning the yard, breathing in the new world around him. There were no cages here, no boundaries. It was just him, the earth, and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. The door closed gently behind him, and the house behind him felt like a safe haven, his home, a real home, one he never thought he would have again. Hunter turned back toward Emily, his tail giving a small, tentative wag. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show her that he was starting to believe. He was starting to trust. Maybe, just maybe, he had finally found where he belonged. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like, and share this video to keep the good vibes rolling and inspire me to create more exciting content for you. The following days at his new home felt like a delicate balance. Hunter slowly adjusting to this strange, safe world that was slowly becoming familiar. The gentle rhythms of life continued as usual. The quiet mornings with the smell of fresh coffee in the air, Emily's soft footsteps as she moved through the house, and Daniel's calm voice when he called him over to play. But while the peace of his new life was comforting, Hunter couldn't shake the nagging fear that at any moment it could all disappear. Though his body was beginning to relax, his mind wasn't as trusting. His instincts, honed in the cold, unforgiving shelter, remained sharp, warning him to stay cautious, to keep a part of himself locked away. As the days passed, Hunter still found himself retreating into the shadows when they moved too quickly or when they tried to give him too much attention. He would walk slowly around the house, taking refuge in corners where he could watch them without getting too close. Every time they reached out to pet him, he flinched. Every time they moved too fast, he tensed, waiting for the unexpected change he had grown used to in the shelter, returning him to the cold, impersonal world that had once been his life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Hunter lay by the couch, resting his head on his paws, when he heard a loud, unfamiliar sound. The doorbell rang. At first, he didn't react. He had heard that noise before at the shelter, the echo of visitors coming and going. But this time was different. This was his new home, not the shelter. This was supposed to be his safe place. Emily and Daniel both froze. Hunter's ears perked up, his body tense as he watched them. They exchanged a quick glance, something unreadable flashing between them. It was a look that Hunter hadn't seen before, something unsettling, almost nervous. Emily stood slowly, walking toward the door, her expression shifting into one of quiet uncertainty. Hunter's stomach twisted. What was happening? Who was at the door? Was this it? Was this the moment he had been waiting for, when the warmth of this home would be taken away, and he would be left to return to the cold, empty shelter? His heart began to race as he stood up, his paws trembling slightly. Emily opened the door, revealing a man standing on the porch, a stranger with a serious expression. Hunter's instinct told him to retreat, to hide, but his legs wouldn't move. He watched intently from the shadows, his mind racing with questions. What did this man want? Why was he here? "Hello," the man greeted politely, though his voice was firm. "I'm here about the adoption of this dog." His eyes darted over to Hunter, who instinctively lowered his head, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. "I'm Hunter's former owner," the man continued, a hint of discomfort in his voice. "I'm afraid I've come to reclaim him." The words hit Hunter like a sudden blow. His breath caught in his throat, and his body froze. He couldn't breathe. His mind was reeling. The familiar coldness of the shelter seemed to rush back to him in an instant. The rejection, the pain, the fear of being unwanted again. This was his past, knocking on the door of his new life, threatening to tear apart everything he had begun to trust. Emily and Daniel stood silent for a long moment, the tension between them palpable. Hunter could feel it, to the fear, the uncertainty. He had never considered that this could happen. He had never thought about the possibility that someone from his past could show up and take him away. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced from Emily to Daniel. What would they do? Would they give him up? Would they send him back to the place where he had been abandoned? "Wait," Emily said quietly, her voice trembling. "We've already adopted him. He's been with us 4 weeks now. We're his family." The man shifted uncomfortably on the doorstep, his eyes flickering with a mix of anger and desperation. "He was mine," he insisted. "I've been looking for him. I want him back." The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Hunter felt as though the entire world had narrowed down to this moment, this confrontation. He couldn't move. He couldn't look away. His heart felt like it was being torn into. The memory of his old life, the life he thought he had left behind, was resurfacing. But there was something else, to a flicker of warmth, a flicker of hope, that made him hesitate. He wasn't the same dog that had been abandoned before. He wasn't the scared, lost pup who had wandered the shelter, waiting for a family that would never come. He had found something here. He had found a place, a family. Was he really ready to lose that? Emily and Daniel were standing firm. Emily's hands were trembling as she clenched the door handle, but there was determination in her eyes. "He's ours now," she said, her voice steadying. "You gave him up. You left him. He's not yours to take any more." The tension hung in the air like a thick fog, the weight of the words sinking into the silence. Hunter's breathing slowed as he stood motionless, his eyes locked on the man, waiting. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe something that seemed impossible. He belonged here. The man stood there for a long moment, the anger in his eyes slowly fading into resignation. He turned to leave without another word, disappearing into the darkening evening. The door closed softly behind him, and the silence that followed felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Hunter, still frozen, didn't know what to do. The words they had exchanged echoed in his mind. They had chosen him. They had fought for him. Emily turned to him, her eyes softening as she knelt down, reaching out to him with a gentle hand. "You're safe now, Hunter," she whispered, her voice filled with warmth. "You're home." Hunter felt a flood of emotions wash over him: relief, fear, joy, but most of all, a sense of belonging. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward, his body relaxing, his tail giving a tentative wag. He wasn't going anywhere. The door clicked shut, the soft thud echoing in the quiet house. Hunter stood motionless in the dim light of the entryway, his breath steadying as the tension from the confrontation started to fade, though the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. His body, which had been rigid with fear, began to relax, but his mind was still racing. His heart had pounded in his chest, every instinct telling him to run, to hide, to protect himself. But now, as he stood there, the adrenaline ebbed away, leaving a strange sense of peace. Emily and Daniel were silent for a moment, standing close, exchanging glances wordlessly of understanding the heaviness of the situation. Hunter's eyes flickered between them, watching their every move. He had never seen them look so unsure, so vulnerable. They, too, had been shaken by the visit. "Is he gone?" Daniel finally asked, his voice low, breaking the silence. Emily nodded, though her eyes were filled with something Hunter couldn't quite place. Relief, yes, but also lingering uncertainty. She stepped back from the door, gently closing it the rest of the way. The sudden stillness of the house felt like an almost unbearable weight after the storm that had just passed through. Hunter remained in the same spot, unwilling to move. His mind was overwhelmed with the realization of what had just happened. He had been wanted by someone once, and now he had been claimed again, taken away by a man who had called himself his owner. But that wasn't the whole truth. His real home, the place he truly belonged, was here, with Emily and Daniel. As the minutes passed, the tension began to dissipate, replaced by an almost palpable quiet. Daniel crouched down to Hunter's level, his eyes soft and reassuring. "Hey, buddy," he said quietly, his voice steady, but with a trace of something like exhaustion. "It's over now, you're safe." Emily, standing beside Daniel, slowly crouched as well, her hands outstretched toward Hunter. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," she said, her voice soft with tenderness. "We'll never leave you." Hunter's heart beat a little faster as her words sank in. His mind told him to stay cautious, to stay guarded, but the warmth of her presence and the unspoken promises in her eyes made something stir deep inside him. He was safe. He wasn't going anywhere, and for the first time in his life, that feeling didn't seem like a dream. With a deep breath, Hunter slowly stepped forward, moving cautiously toward Emily and Daniel. His muscles were still tight, his instincts still alert, but he no longer felt like he was walking into the unknown. He was stepping into a place where he belonged. When he reached Emily, he stopped just shy of her hand, unsure if he was ready to fully surrender to the calm she offered. His body tensed, but instead of retreating, he let himself lean into her warmth. She gently placed her hand on his head, and for the first time since he had arrived, he felt the full weight of her kindness, no longer a fleeting touch, but a gesture that felt permanent, real. "You're a brave boy," Emily whispered, her voice gentle as she stroked his fur. "You've been through so much, but you're home now. You don't have to be afraid." Her words seeped into him like moonlight after a storm, and slowly, he relaxed. He lowered his head, his body inching closer, the comforting sense of her familiar now. He could feel the heartbeat of the house steady, constant, reassuring, and with it, the understanding that this was the place where he was meant to be. For the first time in his life, he didn't need to wait for the other shoe to drop. He didn't need to fear abandonment or rejection. The past was still there, lingering in his mind, but it no longer held him captive. He had found something worth believing in, something worth fighting for. Daniel reached out, his voice calm but steady. "Come here, Hunter," he said, his hand resting lightly on the dog's back. Hunter blinked up at him, and for a brief moment, he saw something in Daniel's eyes, a quiet strength, a promise that nothing would ever take him away again. Hunter took a step forward, and then another, until he was standing beside Emily, leaning into both of them. His heart, once heavy with doubt, now began to swell with something new, something he had never dared feel before: love, loyalty, hope. The weight of the man's visit had been like a storm, but now the calm was settling in, and for the first time in years, Hunter allowed himself to believe that this was it. This was his forever. He wasn't just another dog waiting for a second chance. He was home. Emily and Daniel stood together, their arms around each other, watching him with quiet smiles. Their patience had won out. Their love had saved him. And as Hunter closed his eyes, his head resting comfortably against them, he felt the first true peace he had known in so long. The storm had passed. The darkness had cleared, and now there was nothing but light. The night after the confrontation at the door, Hunter lay in his bed, his body still tense, but his mind racing. It had been a quiet evening since the man had left, but the events from earlier weighed heavily on him. He had been rescued, he had been loved, and yet, somewhere deep inside, a lingering fear still gnawed at his heart. The doorbell ringing, the stranger who claimed to be his owner. The panic that surged through him, it was too much to process all at once. The calm he had felt earlier now seemed fragile, as if the peace he had begun to settle into could easily be shattered. He tried to sleep, curling up in the dog bed by the couch, but sleep evaded him. His mind wandered to the man who had come to take him away. What if he came back? What if it wasn't over? What if the safety he had found here wasn't real? His eyes darted to the front door. His ears perked every time he heard a noise in the distance. Emily had noticed his restlessness, and while she had tried to comfort him, there was a whirring in her eyes, too. She didn't speak of it, but Hunter could see it, the same unease that had taken root in his heart. The thought that his past could return, that he could lose everything again, was too much for him to bear. And now, with the image of that man still fresh in his mind, Hunter couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something worse. Hours passed in the silence of the night. The clock ticked steadily, but it felt like time was stretching. Then, suddenly, the sound of the doorbell rang out again, this time much more forcefully. Hunter's heart skipped a beat. His muscles tensed, his body immediately frozen in place. His instincts flared. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The world around him seemed to slow down as his mind raced, desperate to make sense of the situation. It was as if the ground beneath him had shifted, and the safe space he had finally found was slipping away, leaving him vulnerable and exposed once more. His ears twitched toward the door, his whole body on alert. He could hear the faint murmur of voices, Emily and Daniel speaking quietly, their tones urgent but low. Then the sound of footsteps, growing louder as someone approached the door. Hunter's chest tightened. He had to move. He had to get out of here before it all fell apart. His paws moved without thinking, taking him from the safety of his bed to the hallway. He padded silently toward the front door, his head low, his body braced for what he feared was coming. Every instinct told him to run, to hide, but he was trapped, caught between the life he had begun to love and the terrifying thought that it could all be taken from him at any moment. Emily was at the door now, talking in a hurried but controlled voice, her words muffled by the barrier. Hunter pressed his nose against the cool wood, straining to hear. He could make out a few words. Please ... we already. He's happy here ... but the rest was lost in the distance, drowned out by the pounding of his own heart. What if the man came to take him again? What if they couldn't protect him? And then, the door creaked open. Hunter's breath hitched as a shadow stepped into the light. The figure of a man he didn't recognize, standing tall with an air of authority. Hunter's body went rigid, his mind racing. He tried to comprehend what was happening. His instincts screamed at him to run, to retreat to the back of the house and hide. But he didn't move. The man's cold, calculating eyes swept the room, landing on Hunter, who stood frozen at the edge of the hallway. The man's gaze was sharp, demanding, as if he was reclaiming something he had once lost. I'm sorry, but I've come to take him back. The man's voice rang out, his words cold and final. Hunter's heart shattered in an instant. The pain of the past rushed over him, memories of abandonment, of never knowing where he belonged, of always being let down when he thought he had found safety. The air around him seemed to go still, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse. But then, something inside him shifted. It was the same feeling he had felt when Emily and Daniel had first opened their hearts to him, the same quiet strength that had started to grow when he realized he was safe with them. He wasn't going to let this man take him away. Not again. His paws moved of their own accord, stepping out from the shadows and into the light, standing tall. The man's gaze snapped to him, a faint sneer playing at the corner of his lips. Hunter didn't back down. He stood his ground. The man stood there, blocking the doorway, his eyes narrowed in determination as he stared at Hunter. His presence was imposing, filled with the kind of authority that made the air feel thick, suffocating. But Hunter didn't retreat this time. He had felt that sinking fear before, when he was abandoned, when he was just another dog left behind to face the world alone. But not now, not today. The man's eyes flicked back to Emily and Daniel, as if looking for confirmation that this was a fight worth having. But neither Emily nor Daniel moved. They stood firm, side by side, their expressions a mix of defiance and quiet resolve. Emily's voice broke the silence first, her words steady. Even though Hunter could hear the raw edge of worrying in her tone. "You gave him up," Emily said, her voice unyielding. "He's ours now. He's home." Hunter felt a surge of gratitude for her, for Daniel, as they stood their ground. The strength they had shown, the way they had chosen him, made his heart swell with something fierce. Something real. The man's jaw clenched, his frustration evident. "I never wanted to give him up," he snapped. "I lost my job, my house. I couldn't take care of him. But he's mine. He belongs to me. I have the papers." Hunter's heart stuttered. The man had come with papers, the same thing he had seen time and time again at the shelter documents, that made everything seem official, that made ownership feel like it meant something. But that was before he knew what home really felt like. Before he had found love. Before he had a family that fought for him. He glanced up at Emily and Daniel, who were standing close, their faces set in determination, but there was a flicker of worrying in their eyes, too. Hunter could sense it. They were scared, not just for themselves, but for him. But they were ready to fight. Hunter's heart raced, the weight of the situation settling in. This wasn't just about a man showing up to claim him. This was about something deeper. It was about belonging, about choosing a place and a family that accepted him. This man's claim on him was not enough to erase the love that had already been built in this home. As the man stepped forward, trying to push past Emily, something in Hunter snapped. His legs tensed, and before he even realized what he was doing, he was standing in front of Emily, his body blocking her from the man's approach. The man halted, taken aback by the sudden movement. Hunter could feel his muscles trembling with the force of his own fear. But something stronger than fear pushed him forward. The man scarfed, his gaze cold. "What are you going to do, dog? You think you can stop me?" Hunter's tail was tucked low, but his stance was firm. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the dog cowering behind bars. He wasn't the one waiting to be left behind. He wasn't going to be a pawn in someone else's game anymore. Emily reached out, placing her hand gently on Hunter's side. Her voice a whisper of reassurance. "He's not yours anymore, he's ours. And we're not giving him up." There was a long, drawn-out silence, the tension between them thick, suffocating. The man took a step back, looking between Hunter, Emily, and Daniel. His expression faltered, and for a moment, Hunter thought that maybe, just maybe, this fight would end here. But then the man spoke, his voice sharp and final. "You'll regret this," he spat. "You'll regret keeping him from me." Hunter's breath quickened, but he held his ground, not backing away from the man's cold words. The familiar feeling of abandonment and fear had flooded back, but this time it was different. He wasn't alone anymore. He was ready to face whatever came next. For the first time, he didn't have to be afraid. The man's words echoed in the room, his threat hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. Emily and Daniel stood at the front of the house, facing the man who had come to take Hunter back, but there was a strength in their stance now, something that made them unyielding. They had already chosen their path, and there was no turning back. Hunter stood firm, his body tense with every breath. The man's presence was overwhelming, but he didn't flinch. His legs were trembling slightly, but his heart was steady. For the first time, he realized that this wasn't just about a fight for him, it was about protecting everything he had come to know as his own. The warm home, the gentle love, the safety that had been promised to him, and which he had slowly, cautiously, allowed himself to believe in. The man glared at Hunter one last time, the malice in his eyes slowly giving way to a hint of realization. He had come here thinking he could reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. But the scene before him made it clear. Hunter was no longer a lost dog, a stray in need of rescue. Hunter had a family now, a family who would fight for him, just as he would fight for them. "Fine," the man muttered, his voice filled with bitter resignation. "But don't think this is over. I'll be back, and I'll make sure you regret this." Hunter felt the weight of his words, but instead of retreating, he stood taller, his body steady. The man had no power here. This wasn't his fight to win anymore. The man turned sharply and marched away, disappearing into the night with a last, frustrated glance over his shoulder. The door slammed shut behind him, and for a long, drawn-out moment, there was only silence. Hunter remained where he stood, his heart still racing from the confrontation. The adrenaline that had surged through his body began to ebb, but his legs were still shaking slightly. His eyes met Emily and Daniel's, and for a moment, no words were needed. The relief, the unspoken understanding, passed between them as they took in the weight of what had just happened. Emily knelt down in front of Hunter, her eyes full of warmth and compassion. "You're safe, Hunter. You don't have to be afraid anymore," she whispered, her voice soft, but filled with conviction. Hunter's heart swelled as he took a small, cautious step forward, his body relaxing under her gentle touch. He felt the weight of the past lifting from his shoulders, replaced with the promise of something new. He had made it through this storm, and though he knew it wouldn't be the last challenge they would face together, he also knew that he didn't have to face it alone. Daniel stepped forward, his hand reaching out to rest gently on Hunter's back. "You're one of us now," he said, his voice steady and filled with pride. "We'll protect you, always." The finality of the man's departure settled in. Hunter wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't just another stray. He wasn't going to be abandoned again. He had a family now, one who loved him. And as he stood there, feeling the warmth of Emily's hand and Daniel's quiet presence beside him, he realized that this moment was his turning point. The past might have shaped him, but it didn't define him. Hunter had found his forever home. As the house grew quiet again, with only the soft sound of the wind rustling outside, Hunter allowed himself to believe in that truth. He wasn't just waiting anymore. He was living. He was loved. And for the first time, he was home. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like, and share this video to keep the good vibes rolling and inspire me to create more exciting content for you. The house was still. The air was thick with the aftermath of the confrontation, the storm that had passed through only a short time ago. Hunter stood at the edge of the living room, his body still, but his mind racing. The man had gone, but the anxiety, the fear, lingered. The peace that had once seemed so certain felt fragile now, as if the foundation of the life he had built here could be easily shaken again. But as he looked at Emily and Daniel, something inside him shifted. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of his mind, but he could feel the strength in the room, the strength that Emily and Daniel had shown when they stood up for him. It was the same strength that was now pushing him to confront his own fears, to push through the doubt and hesitation that had held him back for so long. The next few days were quieter, but the tension still hung in the air. It wasn't just the man's return that haunted Hunter. It was the fear of what he couldn't control, the thought of losing everything again, of being taken back to a place where love felt like an illusion, consumed him. But as each day passed, he began to see something in Emily and Daniel's eyes, an unspoken promise that they would never give up on him. They had chosen him, and they were going to fight for him just as much as he had fought for himself. Hunter began to move with more confidence around the house. Even though the anxiety still lingered in his chest, he had always been cautious, always alert. But now he was learning that the world could be safe, that he could trust again. There were moments when his heart would race, when the past would creep up on him, but slowly, he learned how to quiet those fears, how to push them aside. One evening, after dinner, Emily sat on the couch, her book resting on her lap. She was watching him, her eyes soft, as if waiting for him to make the next move. Hunter was lying by the window, his body relaxed, but his gaze far away. lost in thought. The house was filled with the soft hum of evening, the ticking of the clock, the gentle rustle of the trees outside, and the faint sounds of the city in the distance. "Hunter," Emily said, her voice gentle, breaking the silence. He lifted his head slowly, meeting her gaze. "I know you're scared," she continued, her voice quiet, "but you don't have to hide from us. We're not going anywhere. You don't have to face this alone." Hunter's heart swelled at her words. There had been times when he doubted this, when he wondered if he would ever truly belong, if the past would always haunt him. But as he looked at Emily and Daniel, as he saw the trust in their eyes, he realized something. They weren't going to leave him. They weren't going to give up on him. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to be afraid anymore. Daniel walked over, kneeling beside him. "We've got you, buddy, always," he said, his voice warm, steady. Hunter felt a shift in himself. The anxiety that had gripped him for so long began to loosen. It wasn't an immediate release. There was still the faint echo of his fears, of what had happened in the past, but it was easier to breathe, easier to accept that this was real. He was no longer just a dog with a past full of uncertainty. He was part of a family now, and no one could take that away. The next few days passed without incident, and while Hunter remained vigilant, he began to settle into the rhythm of his new life. He played more in the yard, enjoying the freedom of running across the grass, feeling the wind in his fur. He spent evenings with Emily and Daniel, curled up on the couch, their presence comforting and constant. The fear that had once paralyzed him, that had kept him in the shadows, started to fade, replaced by a quiet trust. One afternoon, as Hunter lay on his bed, watching Emily prepare dinner in the kitchen, he felt a sense of peace that had once seemed impossible. The past was still there, lurking in the back of his mind, but it no longer had control over him. The future, with its unknowns, was still uncertain, but Hunter had learned to face it with courage. The love and stability he had found here gave him the strength to face whatever came next. As the days went on, the fear that had once consumed him slowly faded. It wasn't gone entirely, but it no longer ruled his every move. Hunter knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, that life would throw challenges his way. But for the first time in a long time, he knew that he didn't have to face them alone. He had a family now, a real family. And nothing, not even the ghosts of his past, could take that away from him. As the days unfolded, the sense of peace in the house gradually deepened, but Hunter was still haunted by the remnants of his past. The fear that had once dictated every aspect of his life wasn't completely gone. He couldn't erase the memories of the cold shelter, the feeling of abandonment, or the nagging thought that everything he had gained might one day be taken from him. But with each passing day, he found himself moving forward. He began to trust the routine. The sound of Emily's voice, the warmth of Daniel's presence, these things were constants, things he could rely on. Slowly, Hunter began to understand that he wasn't just a dog in a temporary home. He was part of something real, something lasting. One evening, as the sun set and the soft glow of the porch light cast long shadows across the yard, Hunter found himself outside again. The breeze was warm, carrying the scent of the earth and the faint hum of life in the neighborhood. For the first time, Hunter didn't feel the rush of anxiety when he stepped outside. The freedom of the yard felt different now, no longer an open space he might be taken from, but a place where he belonged. Emily came out to join him, her voice soft as she called to him, "Hunter, come here, buddy." Without hesitation, Hunter trotted toward her, his tail wagging gently as he reached her side. Emily crouched down to give him a scratch behind the ears, something that had once made him flinch, but now brought a sense of calm. "You know," Emily said, looking out at the yard, "we've been through a lot, haven't we? But look at you now, you're settling in, you're safe." Hunter's heart swelled with emotion at her words. He had felt that shift in himself, the change that was both subtle and profound. The fear he had carried for so long wasn't as overpowering anymore. It was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but it no longer controlled him. He had found his place, his home, and he wasn't going to let fear take that away. As the weeks passed, Hunter's transformation became even more apparent. The once cautious dog, who had tiptoed around every corner, avoiding eye contact and shrinking from sudden movements, now walked confidently through the house. His steps were steadier, his tail wagged more freely. He even sought out moments of affection, leaning into Emily and Daniel when they came near, accepting their love without hesitation. One afternoon, Daniel took him for a walk through the neighborhood, the leash hanging loosely in his hand as they strolled down the quiet streets. For the first time, Hunter didn't tug at the leash, trying to rush ahead or retreat into the shadows. He walked beside Daniel, his eyes bright, his body relaxed. He wasn't looking for an escape. He was simply enjoying the moment, enjoying the company of the person who had come to mean so much to him. They passed by a park, and Daniel stopped, turning to look down at Hunter. "You ready to play, buddy?" Hunter's ears perked up at the wordplay. He had never quite understood the concept of play, at least not in the way Daniel seemed to mean it. The idea of being free, of chasing after something without fear of being called back, felt like a foreign thought. But as Daniel threw a ball into the open field, Hunter felt something inside him stir. Maybe it was time to try. Hunter took off in a burst of energy, chasing the ball with a newfound sense of freedom. The wind whipped past his ears, and for the first time, he ran without hesitation, without fear of what might happen if he failed. The ball was his goal, but the joy of running, of being in the open space, was even greater. He ran in circles, his tail high, barking joyfully as he chased after the ball Daniel had thrown. Daniel stood by the sidelines, watching him with a proud smile on his face. "That's my boy," he murmured. Hunter skidded to a halt, panting happily as he retrieved the ball, his tail wagging faster than ever. He trotted back to Daniel, dropping the ball at his feet. This was the moment when he realized that the fear he had carried for so long was finally being replaced with something much more powerful: confidence, belonging, love. As they walked back home together, the sun beginning to set on the quiet streets, Hunter glanced up at Daniel. He had come so far. He wasn't just a dog living in a shelter anymore. He wasn't just a dog caught between two worlds. He was part of a family now, a family that had chosen him, who would always be there to protect him. The road ahead would have its challenges, but for the first time in his life, Hunter felt ready to face them. He had everything he needed right here. And for the first time in years, Hunter didn't feel like he was waiting anymore. He wasn't waiting for a second chance. He wasn't waiting for love. He had found it. He was home. The days that followed the confrontation with the man were a turning point for Hunter, a quiet but powerful shift in the way he saw himself and the world around him. The fear that had once gripped him so tightly, the anxiety that kept him on edge, slowly began to loosen its hold. He could still feel the remnants of the past, the memories of abandonment, the sharp pang of rejection, but they didn't control him anymore. He had come to realize that the family he had found, the home that Emily and Daniel had given him, was a fortress that nothing could take away. Hunter's recovery wasn't instant. It wasn't a sudden surge of happiness or an overnight transformation, but with each passing day, he grew more confident, more assured of his place in this world. The once constant vigilance he had carried like a heavy burden began to fade as he learned that he didn't have to live in fear anymore. He was safe, he was loved, and that truth, no matter how much he had doubted it before, was finally sinking into his heart. The first time he slept through the night without waking up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest, was a small but significant victory. The first time he ran through the yard without looking over his shoulder, without waiting for something to go wrong, was a moment of freedom that he had never experienced before. And with each step forward, each small victory, he realized that the person he was becoming, someone who could trust, who could love, who could find joy in the present, was a person he had always longed to be. Emily and Daniel noticed the change, too. It was subtle, But it was there. Hunter no longer hesitated when Emily reached out to pet him. He no longer shrank away from sudden movements or loud noises. He no longer sat in the corner, avoiding the world around him. Instead, he sought out their company, moving closer, leaning in when they sat together on the couch. He would rest his head on their laps without flinching, allowing himself to fully embrace the affection they offered. One afternoon, Emily took him for a walk through the park, the sun shining brightly overhead. As they walked side by side, Hunter's pace was relaxed, his steps even. The scent of flowers filled the air, and the soft rustle of leaves in the trees sounded like a melody to his ears. He no longer felt the need to rush ahead or retreat into himself. Instead, he trotted along happily beside Emily, his tail wagging in time with the rhythm of their steps. "I'm so proud of you, Hunter," Emily murmured, glancing down at him with a smile that reached her eyes. "You've come so far." Hunter looked up at her, his heart swelling with emotion. He couldn't find the words to express what he felt, but the gratitude, the warmth, was overwhelming. The love she had given him, the patience Daniel had shown, had helped him heal in ways he never thought possible. They had never given up on him, even when he had been too scared to trust them fully. And now, with every step he took beside them, he knew without a doubt that he was part of something real. He was no longer the scared dog from the shelter. He was Hunter, a dog who belonged, who was cherished, and who would never be abandoned again. As the days passed, the bond between Hunter and his family deepened. He spent more time playing in the yard, chasing after the ball with the same joy he had discovered during that first game with Daniel. He no longer hesitated to approach the front door when they came home, no longer cowered at the sound of footsteps. Instead, he greeted them with an excited bark and a wagging tail, knowing that they were there for him, always. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Hunter resting his head on Daniel's lap, the warmth of the fire crackling softly in the background, Hunter felt a sense of peace he had never known before. This was home, this was family, and it was everything he had ever needed. He had fought through the darkness of his past, the fear that had shaped him for so long, and now, in the light of the love Emily and Daniel had given him, he felt the weight of that fear lift. He was no longer just a dog who had been left behind. He was Hunter, a beloved part of a family, strong in his own right, ready to face whatever came next with courage, trust, and love. The transformation that had begun that night, the moment he stood tall in front of Emily and Daniel, refusing to be taken back to his old life, was only the beginning. He had come so far, and there was still so much more to explore, but for the first time, he knew that no matter what the future held, he had everything he needed right here. In this home, with these people, he was finally home. The weeks that followed were filled with an undeniable sense of peace and belonging. Hunter had finally settled into his new life with Emily and Daniel. The fear and hesitation that had once clouded his every step had dissipated like fog lifting with the morning sun. The house, which had once felt like an unfamiliar place, now held a warmth and security that made him feel safe in a way he never thought possible. He was no longer a dog haunted by his past. He was Hunter, a cherished member of a family, no longer just surviving but thriving. Emily and Daniel had been patient, giving him the space he needed while never backing away from their promise to be there for him. They had shown him, through their actions, that love wasn't just a word, it was a quiet but powerful force that could heal even the deepest wounds. One afternoon, as Hunter lay in his favorite spot by the window, looking out at the world beyond, he noticed the familiar sound of Emily's voice calling from the kitchen. Her tone was light, and there was a hint of playfulness in her words. "Hey, Hunter, want to go for a walk?" At the sound of the word walk, Hunter's tail began to wag, his whole body lighting up with excitement. It was one of his favorite things to do now, walking side by side with Emily, his leash loose but secure, feeling the wind rush past him as they strolled through the neighborhood. The simple joy of moving through the world with her, of exploring new places, made him feel more alive than he had ever felt before. As Emily grabbed his leash and gently attached it to his collar, Hunter stood up, stretching his legs with a contented sigh. The motion was effortless now. No more hesitation, no more fear that the walk might turn into something that led back to the shelter or an unfamiliar, uncomfortable place. This was his life now, and he was ready for whatever came next. The two of them walked out the door, and Hunter couldn't help but glance over his shoulder at Daniel, who stood at the door with a knowing smile, waving them off as they headed down the street. The family bond, the sense of togetherness, filled him with a deep warmth. It wasn't just the walk, it was everything that had led up to it, all the moments, big and small, that had slowly built the life they now shared. As they walked through the park, Hunter's steps were steady, confident. The grass beneath his paws felt soft and inviting, a reminder that he had found a place to call home. He could hear children laughing in the distance, the sound of a ball bouncing in the yard, the rustling of leaves in the trees. It was a peaceful scene, but there was something new in the air today, a feeling of finality, as if everything had come full circle. The man who had once claimed him as his own was a distant memory now, and the fears that had once held Hunter back was slipping away for good. At the far end of the park, they reached a quiet bench under a large oak tree. Emily sat down first, patting the space beside her, inviting Hunter to join. He didn't hesitate. He climbed onto the bench, sitting next to her, his body relaxing as he leaned into her side. She wrapped her arm around him, her fingers gently stroking his fur. For a long moment, they sat in silence, watching the world go by. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden light over everything. The moment felt timeless, as if it could stretch on forever. Hunter's eyes closed for a moment, feeling the warmth of Emily's presence beside him and the security that came with it. This was it. This was home. In that moment, Hunter understood something that had eluded him for so long. Home wasn't just a place. It wasn't the walls of a house or the comfort of a bed. Home was where love and trust existed, where family came together to heal each other's wounds. It was the moments of quiet tenderness, the shared glances, the knowing smiles. It was the peace that came with belonging. Emily whispered softly, as if reading his thoughts, "You've come so far, Hunter, and I'm so proud of you." Hunter's heart swelled at her words, but it was more than just pride he felt. It was a deep, unspoken bond between them. He had fought for his place here, and in doing so, he had earned it. He wasn't just a dog rescued from a shelter anymore. He was Hunter, a dog who had found his family and his forever home. The soft rustle of leaves stirred the air around them, and Hunter lifted his head, looking out across the park. His eyes no longer held the wariness they once had. There was no looking over his shoulder, no fear that something would take this all away. He had found the life he had longed for. He had found peace. As the sky turned from gold to a deep shade of blue, Emily stood up, holding out her hand to him. Hunter followed her lead, feeling lighter than he ever had before, his tail wagging with contentment. They walked back together, side by side, into the warmth of their home, where his family was waiting. Hunter had found everything he needed. He had found his place in the world, and he was ready to live every moment of it with the people who loved him. This was his forever, and nothing could take that away. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like, and share this video to keep the good vibes rolling and inspire me to create more exciting content for you.